The morning I watched a woman in a peach cardigan stand on my private road and tell me, with a straight face, "This road belongs to the community now. Deal with it," I learned something I probably should have learned years earlier. Some people think if they act official enough, reality will get embarrassed and step aside. She'd had asphalt poured over my family's road in the middle of the night, bolted up neighborhood signs on my land, painted lines like she was christening a highway, and spent $88,000 of HOA money doing it. Yeah, that happened. My name's Garrett Sable, and the road she was standing on was Sable Lane, a half-mile stretch my father built back in 1987 on our land in East Texas, when this whole area was still fences, red dirt, and pine trees, before anybody started calling cow pasture luxury community living. Dad was a road contractor for most of his life, the kind of man who trusted a transit level more than he trusted a lawyer. And when he bought those 12 acres, the first thing he did was carve a proper access road from the county highway to the house site. He built it right, too. Gravel base, drainage, chip seal, every inch paid for out of his own pocket. Then he recorded it properly as a private thoroughfare tied to our deed. Sable Lane wasn't a nickname, wasn't a local habit, wasn't some vague patch of pavement folks got used to using. It was ours. For a long time, that didn't matter much. Nobody around us cared. Then the farms started disappearing. A developer bought the acreage next door, and suddenly Ridgewood Estates rose out of the dirt with its neat little houses, clubhouse, pool, and the kind of HOA energy that makes grown adults think they've been deputized by heaven. The developer was supposed to build a proper entrance road on the east side of the subdivision, but he took one look at my father's road, already touching the highway, and decided cutting corners was cheaper than building them. He told my dad it would just be temporary, 2 years at most, handshake agreement, neighbor to neighbor, until the real entrance got done. You can probably guess how that went. 2 years became 5, 5 became 10, and then the developer sold out, shut down the LLC, and vanished to wherever men like that go when they've left a mess behind for other people to live with. The people in Ridgewood kept using Sable Lane every day like it had always belonged to them. Dad let it go because he was decent, and because back then the folks coming through mostly waved, drove slow, and minded themselves. He passed in 2019, and I inherited the house, the land, and the road. I moved back with my son, Colton, and tried to keep the peace. Now, I'm not some hothead with a deed and a chip on my shoulder. I'm a civil engineer. I spent 15 years designing drainage systems and road infrastructure for the county before I went private. Property lines, access law, right-of-way issues, road specs, permitting, that wasn't side knowledge for me. That was my day job. So when I say I knew exactly what I owned, I mean I knew it down to the inch. For the first couple of years, I left everything alone. The arrangement was annoying in theory, but manageable in practice. Then Ridgewood elected Darlene Voss as HOA president, and Peace packed its bags and left town. Darlene was the kind of woman who treated a board position like a crown. Blonde bob, expensive sandals, voice sharpened to a point, always carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. She fined people over mailbox paint, wreath sizes, grass height, you name it. If pettiness could wear perfume, it would have smelled like Darlene. I didn't know the full extent of her nonsense at first, but I got introduced quick. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, full of official letterhead and fake authority, telling me Sable Lane had been identified as a community maintenance concern and that I was required to repave it and bring it into compliance with HOA standards within 60 days. I read the thing twice, folded it nice and neat, and put it in a file folder. A week later, the second letter came, meaner this time. The board, according to Darlene, had voted to classify Sable Lane as a shared community thoroughfare, and I was being assessed $4,200 as my portion of the repaving project. If I didn't pay, they'd place a lien on my property. That was the moment I pulled my father's deed from the cabinet, laid it open on the kitchen table, and felt that old calm settle in. The description was clear as church bells on a cold morning. Sable Lane sat entirely within our parcel. Not public, not county, not subdivision, mine. So I answered politely, attached the deed, explained the boundaries, told them they had no jurisdiction over my land, and no authority to assess a dime. Sent it certified mail. 3 days later, Darlene showed up at my front door smiling like a politician at a ribbon cutting. She stood there in a peach cardigan and told me she understood my confusion, but after 15 years of neighborhood use, the road had become common property in practical terms. Then she said I should be grateful the HOA was only asking me to share the cost. I told her, very calmly, that I was a civil engineer, that I knew the difference between long-term use and legal ownership, and that no easement had ever been recorded. She tilted her head, smiled wider, and said, "Well, Garrett, we'll just have to see about that, won't we?" You know what I mean when I say some people don't leave a conversation, they linger in the air. She walked off my porch, but that entitlement stayed behind like a smell. After that, it turned into harassment by paperwork, then harassment by theater. My work truck got slapped with a violation sticker for being parked on a community roadway while it was sitting on my own property. A few days later, somebody put a parking boot on Colton's bicycle near our garage, claiming it obstructed a community-adjacent pathway. My garage, my land, my bike. My patience was getting tested, but I stayed quiet and kept documenting. Then Darlene called county code enforcement and reported that I had inoperable vehicles stored on a public right-of-way. A young officer came out, looked over the deed, the survey, and the county road records, and actually apologized to me for the waste of time. He said, "Sir, this isn't public, and it sure isn't community property." I filed his report in the folder. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the parking began. Cars started lining both sides of Sable Lane, not near the subdivision entrance, not for a few hours, but all the way up toward my house. Day after day, like the HOA was planting flags with bumpers and license plates. I asked one man, washing his Tahoe on my pavement, whether Darlene had told him to use my road as overflow parking. He shrugged and said the HOA email called it available community parking during the clubhouse renovation. I photographed every vehicle, every plate, every date, every time. The folder got thicker. Then Darlene tried to get the county to reclassify Sable Lane under a prescriptive easement claim, arguing the neighborhood had used it openly for over 15 years and now had a permanent right to it. Let me back up a sec. In Texas, continuous use can matter, sure, but only if that use was hostile, not permitted. If the owner allowed it, even informally, the clock doesn't start. And that's where she stepped on a rake without realizing it. My father kept a little leather journal in his desk, the kind a man carries for years until it starts looking like part of his hand. In an entry from March of 2003, he'd written that he told the developer the residents could use the road until the east entrance got built. Temporary. Permissive. Plain as daylight. I found that line, photographed the page, and took it all to my attorney, Walter Hines, a land use lawyer with 30 years under his belt and a voice that sounded like gravel in a whiskey glass. Walter read the deed, read the journal, and smiled that slow smile lawyers get when stupidity has finally become expensive. We filed our response. Deed, survey, road classification, journal, affidavit from an old neighbor who remembered the handshake agreement, all of it. 3 weeks later, the county denied Darlene's claim. Sable Lane was private, had always been private, and no prescriptive easement existed. Now, a reasonable person might have taken that loss, backed up, and tried to work something out. Darlene was not a reasonable person. That night, according to half the neighborhood, she stood up in an HOA meeting and screamed that the county was corrupt and she'd handle this herself. I wrote that sentence down because when crazy people announce their plan, you ought to listen. About 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday night, I was helping Colton with a school project at the kitchen table, gluing foam planets onto a hanger, when I heard diesel engines outside. Not one engine, several. I went to the window and saw headlights creeping down Sable Lane like a convoy. By 2 in the morning, Darlene had a paving crew resurfacing my road. I stood in my doorway and watched them lay hot asphalt over my father's chip seal, install speed bumps, paint double yellow lines, and bolt Ridgewood Estates signs into concrete posts on my land. They worked under floodlights, quick and confident, like confidence could substitute for ownership. By sunrise, they were gone. And at about 8 that morning, there she was, Darlene, standing on my road in that same peach cardigan, smiling like she'd conquered Normandy, telling me, "This road belongs to the community now. Deal with it." I looked at her, looked at the fresh asphalt, smelled that warm tar in the morning air, and did the last thing she expected. I smiled, because what she thought was a victory was actually a signed confession spread half a mile long. The paving was unauthorized. It was unpermitted. The HOA money had been spent without proper approval. The work had been done on private property with recorded title. She hadn't solved her problem. She had gift-wrapped mine. Walter said, "She just made your year." And he was right. The next 6 weeks were all paper, law, and patience. I hired a surveyor who pinned the boundaries all along the road and filed an updated survey. We reported the unpermitted paving, and the county inspector, a tough woman named Rita Fuentes in steel-toed boots, came out, checked the database, and confirmed no permit had ever been pulled. She opened a code case against the paving company and the HOA. I installed high-definition cameras at both ends of the road. Walter got a restraining order barring any further modification, signage, or construction. Then he filed for declaratory judgment, confirming my exclusive ownership and my right to enforce trespass on the road. The judge reviewed the file and granted it. That meant if people parked on Sable Lane after notice, I could tow them. Now here's the twist Darlene never saw coming. The very people she'd whipped into a frenzy started becoming my best evidence. A retired electrician named Buck, who lived at the edge of Ridgewood and still had a functioning moral compass, began feeding me HOA emails, recordings, screenshots, all of it. Then one night, after somebody slashed my work truck tires, the cameras caught a teenager doing it and Darlene sitting nearby in her SUV with the lights off, just watching. She didn't touch a thing, but there she was, part of the scene, part of the pattern. Not enough for a criminal slam dunk, but more than enough to show harassment. Then she made the fatal move. She emailed the whole neighborhood, telling them to park on Sable Lane that Saturday as a show of solidarity. "He can't tow 100 cars," she wrote. She was right about one thing. I didn't need 100. I called Big Earl's Towing, a friend of my father's, and told him I needed every flatbed he could spare at dawn. He laughed so hard he wheezed, then said, "Your daddy would have loved this." Saturday came in cool and gray, fog hanging low between the pines. By 7:30, there were 52 cars parked bumper to bumper along my road. Some folks had coffee in hand. Some had little flags on dashboards like they were reenacting a revolution instead of trespassing. At 7:45, 14 tow trucks rolled off the county highway and onto Sable Lane in a long rumbling line, diesel engines growling, amber lights flashing, chains rattling like the soundtrack to consequences. I was standing at the mouth of my driveway with the court order on a clipboard. Beside me stood Deputy Tom Huxley from the Sheriff's Department and Walter Hines in a sport coat, looking weirdly pleased with life. Earl's crew got to work. Hook, lift, strop, roll. Efficient as surgery. Doors started flying open all over Ridgewood. Folks came out in slippers, robes, sleeve shirts, holding mugs, staring like the sky had cracked open. One woman screamed that I couldn't do this. The deputy held up the order and said, calm as a pond, "Ma'am, this is a private road. Please step back." Then Darlene came storming down the sidewalk in yoga pants and a Ridgewood windbreaker, red-faced and wild-eyed, screaming that the road belonged to the community, that I was a thief, that she'd sue all of us. She got louder and louder until Deputy Huxley told her, very plainly, that if she interfered, she'd be arrested. And then she turned and saw her own white Escalade halfway up a flatbed. I'm not proud of how satisfying that was, but I'm not going to lie to you either. Right there on the fresh asphalt she'd paid for, Walter served her with a civil suit, trespass, property damage, unauthorized construction, breach of fiduciary duty, the whole list. A local news crew showed up before the operation was halfway done. One woman from Ridgewood, a retired teacher named Phyllis, looked straight into the camera and said, "We didn't know it was his road. We were told it was ours." That sentence did more damage to Darlene than any lawyer ever could. By 10:30, All 52 vehicles were gone. My crew removed the Ridgewood signs and installed steel-backed private road signs in their place. The county fined the paving company. Their license got suspended. The HOA board held an emergency vote and removed Darlene unanimously. Her insurance wouldn't cover a dime because she'd acted outside her authority, so when the settlement came, it came out of her own assets, $88,000 back for the paving, plus damages and fees. The funny part is, once the smoke cleared, most of the neighbors weren't mad at me. They were mad at her. A few came by to apologize. A couple brought pie, because this is East Texas, and that's how some people say sorry. Eventually, I negotiated a formal, recorded easement with the new board. The neighborhood could keep using Sable Lane, but now it was legal, documented, and governed by an actual maintenance agreement. I kept ownership. They got access. Nobody touched a sign, speed bump, or shovel without my written consent. A few months later, Colton and I were out by the road, setting the last boundary marker. The winter wind was moving through the pines, and he looked at me, grinned, and said, "Grandpa would have watched that tow day in a lawn chair with a cooler." He was right. He would have laughed himself breathless. And that's really what got Darlene in the end. Not the tow trucks, not the cameras, not even a lawsuit. It was arrogance. She never checked the deed, never verified the easement, never pulled a permit, never slowed down long enough to ask the one question that matters before you start throwing power around. Do I actually have the right? She thought being loud was the same as being lawful. Thought confidence could replace ownership. Thought if she pushed hard enough, paper would fold. It didn't. So let me ask you this. If somebody had taken your kindness, mistaken it for weakness, and tried to claim what was legally yours, would you have blown up on day one, or would you have stayed patient and let the law bury them nice and slow? Tell me where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or anybody else who thought your property was their playground, share your story. I want to hear what justice looked like on your road.